Okay, welcome back to Inside Israel, everyone. I'm Joel Chasnoff. So, the first Lebanon War. In Hebrew, it's called Shalom LaGalil, peace to the Galilee. But most Israelis call it Milchemet Lebanon Rishon, the first Lebanon War. It begins on June 6, 1982, when Israel invades southern Lebanon. And our goal is extremely simple. We actually have two goals. Number one, to drive the PLO north away from Israel's northern border so they can no longer attack us. Since 1968, the PLO has been attacking Israel from Lebanon, both inside Israel itself, with really horrific terrorist attacks, blowing up nursery schools and kindergartens, attacking civilians, penetrating over the border and going into kibbutzim, but also attacking Israel abroad in Europe. You know, one of the incidents that led to Israel's entry into Lebanon in June of 82 was the attempted assassination of the Israeli ambassador to the United Kingdom in England. So the PLO was attacking Israel and Israelis, not just in Israel, but in Europe as well. Why since 1968? Because the Six-Day War was in 1967. You had all these Palestinians who then moved into Jordan. There was a lot of chaos, balagan in Jordan, Black September. Thousands and thousands of Palestinians go north into Lebanon. They are members of the PLO, many of them, and they are attacking Israel from Lebanon. So that is one goal of the First Lebanon War, June 6, 1982, to drive the PLO away from Israel's northern border. Our second goal is to install a Christian government in Lebanon so that we don't have to deal with a Muslim government that hates us. Instead, the Christians who are our allies, if we can install a Christian leader, we actually envision that we're going to have peace with Lebanon for years and years, generations to come. That was the original hope when we go into Lebanon in June of 1982. Now, here is what most people do not realize about the First Lebanon War. It's that Israel was not only successful, but we were extremely successful and very fast. Within about 2 months, we had achieved both of our goals. We not only drove the PLO away from the northern border, but we actually expelled many of the PLO leadership from Lebanon. Yasser Arafat, Nobel Peace Prize winner, Yasser Arafat. Let's wrap our head around that one. Yasser Arafat actually flees Lebanon. We drive a lot of the leadership of the PLO out of Lebanon. So we are successful. And number two, we actually help elect a Christian prime minister, Bashir Gemayel. So within 2 months, Israel is successful. Now, yes, there are hiccups along the way. There are casualties. But in terms of our stated war goals, to get the PLO away and to get a Christian government installed, Israel's successful in 1982. You need to know that. However, we end up staying in Lebanon for 18 years. So even though we had achieved both of our war aims within 2 months, we end up staying in Lebanon until May of 2000 for 18 years. So the question is why? Why did we get stuck in Lebanon? Now, from now on, when you hear the word Lebanon, I want you to think of the word quicksand. Okay? Quicksand. That's what Lebanon is. It's a quagmire. It's this mess of a country where it looks so peaceful from the outside, but then when you step in, you get sucked into the mess. And in this case, it was Lebanon's civil war. Lebanon is having a civil war that begins in 1975. And to really understand what's happening in Lebanon and in this June war that we begin when we invade Lebanon in 82, you need to understand who the players are. Like, who are the actual players? Well, on the Lebanese side, you have, of course, the PLO. I mentioned them. But you've also got all these other Muslim factions. You have Shiites, you have Sunnis, you have Alawites, you have Iraqi militants, you have Syrian militants, and then you've got Christians. You have Christian Maronites, you have Phalangists, you have the Druze, and they're all fighting with each other for power in Lebanon. And Israel, I think characteristically, hubristically believes that we can sort it out, that we can impose our will and we can impose our solution. And to understand that, you need to look at the players on the Israeli side. The prime minister in 1982 is Menachem Begin. He is the first non-labor prime minister elected in Israel. Everyone up until then has been labor, whether it's Ben Gurion, Golda Meir. And many Israelis now, older Israelis, look back at Begin sort of with reverence, the same way a lot of older Americans look back at Reagan or Kennedy as sort of these golden ideals of what a president should be. Many older Israelis especially look back at Begin as sort of the ideal of what a prime minister should be. He understood the Arabs. He understood us. He understood the connection between Judaism and a Jewish state without making it too religious. He sort of held up as like the idol of what a prime minister is. So Begin is prime minister, and who's the minister of defense? Ariel Sharon. I'm sure you've heard that name before. Ariel Sharon is a very hawkish right-wing member, but he's not hawkish because he loves war. He's hawkish because he really believes that our Arab enemies need to be taken seriously and need to be wiped out in order for Israel to survive. I really do believe he has good intentions. He sometimes goes too far, but Ariel Sharon is a Zionist through and through and believes that the only way for Israel to survive is not to make peace, but to make war and to destroy our enemies. Okay. So what happens? Israel goes into Lebanon, June of 82. We drive out the PLO. We drive out Arafat. We install this Christian prime minister, Bashir Gemayel. End of story, right? Victory, except that Gamal is assassinated. Bashir Gemayel, who is this Christian prime minister that we have helped elect, he is quickly assassinated by a Syrian militant in Lebanon. And now there's a vacuum. There's no leadership. There's a complete vacuum in Lebanon. And Israel has no choice but to stay. Because if we leave Lebanon at this point, it allows all these warring factions to possibly unite and attack Israel, to cross over the border. Our problems aren't solved. So the thought is that Israel will stay in Lebanon for a few more months, maybe a few more years. But in this vacuum, a new group comes to fruition in Lebanon. And it's a group that I'm sure you've all heard of. And that, of course, would be Hezbollah. Hezbollah does not exist until this vacuum allows it to exist in Lebanon. So one way to put this, I remember when I was in basic training in the Israeli army, we knew we were going to Lebanon eventually. And our officer, our Mefaked Machlaka, our lieutenant, Yaron, he sat us down to give us our introductory session on Lebanon. And the way he put it is that Israel went to the dance with one girl, but then went to bed with another. Meaning we went to Lebanon to fight the PLO, but we ended up staying in Lebanon 18 years to fight Hezbollah. And that 18-year period, that 18-year war, a war of attrition, that's the one I was a part of. And I'll be sharing some of my personal thoughts in a few moments. But a few notes that I want to give you about that first Lebanon war. So number one, this first war in Lebanon that begins in June of 82, it is the first war in Israel's history that is not for Israel's survival. It is not an existential war. And so it has a very different mindset, a very different place in the mindset of Israelis, because all the other wars, Six-Day War, Yom Kippur War, they were literally to stay on the map. This war was to remove a threat that was certainly terrorizing and killing Israelis, but it was not an existential war. And so this was the first war that was very different for Israelis in our psychology. Support for the war was very strong at first, but then quickly the tide turned against it as a lot of Israeli casualties began mounting, and people were asking, well, what are these casualties for? Ultimately, more than 600 Israeli soldiers were killed in that first part of the Lebanon war, with thousands wounded. So that's very important too, that this changed how Israelis think about casualties because it's no longer an existential war. And there are two famous incidents, well, one famous, one not so famous, but two incidents from this first Lebanon war that I want to touch upon. The first is the Sabra and Shatila massacre. This was a refugee camp on the outskirts of Beirut, and basically the Phalangists, which were a Christian group, went into this refugee camp and slaughtered close to 1,000 people. And Ariel Sharon was brought to task for his role in this. Now, what I want to make clear is that Israel did not carry out the Sabra and Shatila massacre. But what the Khan Commission found in Israel is that Ariel Sharon knew that the Phalangists were going to go in. He took no preventive measure to stop them and basically turned the other way, allowing them to do it, to slaughter all these Islamic, not all militants, some were civilians within the Sabra and Shatila camps. So important. Israel did not carry out Sabra and Shatila, but Israel was found culpable in the fact that Ariel Sharon and those under him allowed it to happen, knowing what was going to happen. The second story I want to bring up is a less known story, but I think it's very important if you want to understand Israel and Israelis and who Israelis are. This is the story of Eli Geva. Eli Geva was an officer in the 188th Armored Brigade, which is the armored brigade that I eventually served in. And he was given the order to bring his troops, his tanks, into Lebanon. But he actually refused the order. And he uttered a sentence which I think a lot of young Israelis might not know this sentence, but a lot of older Israelis do know the sentence. And the sentence he uttered was, Ani mistakel b'mishkefet vero'eh yeladim, which means I look through my binoculars and I see children. Basically, Eli Geva was ordered to go into Beirut, but he looked through his binoculars and he saw kids playing, and he refused the order because he knew that innocent children would be killed and they would be caught up in the crossfire if he went into Beirut. So he actually refused the order, and he was brought back to Israel, and Begin eventually removed him from his post, fired him. But to many in Israel, Eli Geva is still seen as a hero. He's the exemplar of what it means to challenge authority, to be ethical in war, and to not just follow orders because it was told what to do, but to maintain your human conscience even when you are fighting in battle. And I just wanted you to know that story because it's a little known story, but Eli Geva is an important figure in Israeli history because of the idea of ethics in battle and that we do hold ourselves to a higher standard. Okay, so technically, Israel's war in Lebanon, Lebanon 1, ends after a few months. But like I said, we end up staying in Lebanon for 18 years, 1982 until 2000. And like I said, this was the operation that I was part of as a tank soldier. And just to give you a very brief background, I grew up in Chicago, went to Solomon Schechter and Camp Ramah, had a very strong Zionist upbringing. Not overly Zionist, but, day school and summer camp. And eventually, after graduating from the University of Pennsylvania, I moved to Israel and became a lone soldier in the IDF. A lone soldier is a soldier who is serving in the army without parents in Israel at the time. And when I was in the army, there were only a few hundred lone soldiers. Nobody knew who we were or what we were doing here. They basically thought we were crazy. And you get all these rights as a lone soldier to go home early on Friday to pay your bills and special days off. You get to go home to visit your family in America or wherever you're from. And it was very hard to get these rights because nobody knew what lone soldiers were. I was drafted into the Armored Corps, 188th Armored Brigade, and after 7 months of training, we eventually went to Lebanon, and we knew from the beginning that we would be going to Lebanon. And We got to ask, what was our goal? All these tank soldiers, infantry soldiers, special forces who were in Lebanon, what was our goal? It was basically to stop Hezbollah from attacking Israel proper. Israel was under attack from Katyusha rockets from Hezbollah and also cross-border attacks from Hezbollah. So we went into the security zone. We set up at the end of the war in 1982, we set up a buffer zone. It was anywhere from 10 miles wide to 20 miles wide north of Israel's border. And it's an occupied zone where there are villages and Lebanese civilians are living there, but dotted among these villages are Israeli bases that we built. And so we are occupying this buffer zone in South Lebanon in order to prevent Hezbollah from attacking Israel. Supposedly, our allies are the South Lebanese Army, the SLA, and the United Nations. We're supposed to be coordinating with them. But again, it is an absolute mess because we're stationed among civilians. We are facing Hezbollah. Hezbollah knows that we will not fire at civilians, so they start firing at us from schools and from orchards and from homes. There were several times that my tank crew, we spotted Hezbollah militants carrying weapons, and we didn't fire upon them because they were in someone's backyard or they were in an orchard. United Nations regulations say that you cannot fire at anywhere that fruit and vegetables is grown. And Hezbollah knew that we wouldn't do it, so they would attack us knowing we wouldn't attack them. It was an absolute mess. And I want to read a short passage from my book, The 188th Crybaby Brigade. My first book is a comedic memoir about my service in the IDF as a lone soldier. I mean, I say comedic, there are a lot of laughs, but there are also some very serious moments as well. And I'm going to read one paragraph where I'm describing what the IDF is doing in Lebanon and what it's actually like. And I think it'll give you a good taste of what we're going through. It's from page 218 of Crybaby Brigade. The point of our nightly ambushes is to go out and find Hezbollah, who themselves are camped out on hillsides looking for us. When Israel first began fighting Hezbollah 15 years ago, our goal was to stop them from attacking Israel with rockets and suicide bombs. But now that we're here in Lebanon, Hezbollah doesn't have to bother attacking Israel. Instead, they can just attack us, the soldiers. We have literally delivered their targets to them. And not just any targets, but the best kind. Young, vibrant Israelis with their entire lives ahead of them. And anytime they kill one, we just ship up a bunch more as replacements. So that was really the quagmire that we got ourselves into during this 18-year war of attrition in Lebanon. Lebanon, Hezbollah, instead of attacking Israel, they had all these soldiers they could attack instead. And the best way to terrorize Israelis is to kill their children. That's what our enemies know. We take the death of one soldier so seriously that when day after day you see on the front pages of newspapers the photos of soldiers who've been killed in Lebanon, that's what it was like in Lebanon, in Israel, for 18 years. Day after day, you'd wake up and there would be another photo on the front page of the latest soldier who'd been killed in Lebanon. And Lebanon got the nickname Israel's Little Vietnam. A lot of Israelis began referring to Lebanon as our own little Vietnam. The point being that we were there to fight this war that had no end in sight and that seemed just to be killing and injuring our young boys without really knowing why we were actually there. In my book, I describe South Lebanon as a game of cat and mouse. We're out looking for them, and they're out looking for us. And the only reason they're out looking for us is because we're out looking for them, except they had the advantage. You need to understand, Hezbollah knew every rock, every tree, every boulder in South Lebanon. They knew where to hide so that they could ambush us. They knew when we changed guard. At maybe 6 a.m., the guard duty shift changes. And they knew that at 6 a.m. we changed the guard. That's when we're vulnerable. That's when we're not paying attention. That's when they would surprise us with an attack. So they had a real advantage. And they also had an advantage because they weren't playing by any ethical standards. They knew that we wouldn't fire at civilian areas, but that means they could fire at us from there. So if there's one takeaway you have from this 18-year security zone, buffer zone that Israel is in Lebanon, it's that it was an absolute mess, quicksand, quagmire. We don't really have an end goal in sight. In May of 2000, it suddenly ends. And when I say suddenly, I mean suddenly. Israel wakes up one morning, and I don't think it's even in the newspaper because the press didn't get hold of it. The radio and TV are announcing that Israel, as we speak, is pulling out of Lebanon. Overnight, during one night in May of 2000, Israeli troops simply leave Lebanon unilaterally. This is the decision of our Prime Minister, Ehud Barak, a former general who was always saying that we shouldn't be in Lebanon. And he simply surprised the country. I think the strategy was he didn't want Hezbollah to know that we were leaving Lebanon. But I have friends from the army who were officers at that time. They were doing reserve duty in Lebanon. And they told me they didn't even know. The day before they were pulling out, they didn't even know that they were going to pull out the next day. They just got the orders that night. They loaded up. And just like that, Israel pulls out of Lebanon in May of 2000. So that is where that chapter ends. May of 2000, Israel leaves Lebanon. Now, before we move on to the next war, I want to just share a couple things. Like I said, it gets the nickname Little Vietnam. There are more than 650 soldiers killed during this time. Two notable incidents you should know about. One is Ason Hamasokim, which is the helicopter disaster. This is a real turning point in this war. In February of 1997, two Israeli military helicopters take off from the Galilee, and they fly to Lebanon with 73 soldiers on board, and they collide midair, and all 73 soldiers on board on the way to Lebanon are killed in one afternoon. And it turns out that the pilots shut off their lights after takeoff, which they were not supposed to do, but they would do anyway so that Hezbollah couldn't see them as they were flying over. There were other procedures and checks that the pilots did not perform. There's a lot of it was all human error. It was human error involved. And this really, for years, Israelis had been protesting our presence in Lebanon, but this helicopter disaster really pushed things over the top because you had 73 soldiers. I told you how seriously Israel takes it if one soldier dies. So imagine a front page of the newspaper the next day where you have 73 photographs on the front page of the newspaper. You can look it up online. You will find pictures of that newspaper from February of 97. It's horrific. And this was a real turning point in ultimately what led to one of the causes that led Israel to pull out of Lebanon 2.5 years later. The other aspect of this time in Lebanon I want you to know about is the four mothers, Arba Imaot. At Passover, we sing that song, 4 are the mothers and 3 are the fathers. Right? So 4 mothers, there's a tradition in Judaism of 4 mothers. Well, there were 4 mothers in Israel. All of them had sons who were serving in Lebanon in combat units. And these 4 mothers got together and they started a protest group called Arba Imaot, the 4 mothers. And it started very grassroots and small, picketing at junctions and writing letters to the editor. But eventually this group swelled to thousands and thousands. It was this entire protest movement called the Four Mothers that was actively petitioning the Israeli government to pull out of Lebanon. They were saying, why are our sons dying there? What are we dying for? And probably their best tactic of all is they would stand outside the house of the prime minister with a big banner, a bed sheet, and on that number would be the number of soldiers who'd been killed in Lebanon. And when, God forbid, another soldier had died or more, they would make a new sheet with the updated number and stand holding it, really to confront the prime minister with this idea of, look how many of our young boys are dying in Lebanon. So if you want to know why Ehud Barak ultimately pulled us out of Lebanon in May of 2000, one is the helicopter disaster, Ason Hamasokim, and the other is the Four Mothers grassroots unit that called for us to leave. In terms of what I remember about being in Lebanon, my strongest memory is of the night before. I'm not sure I had a nervous breakdown, but I was crying. I was on a base in the Golan Heights in northern Lebanon, and we had had our final briefing, knowing that the next morning we were going in. And I guess I kind of did have a nervous breakdown. I mean, I was absolutely bawling. I remember my close friend Tim taking another lone soldier, taking me aside and trying to calm me down. I literally, I felt I was going to die. I was certain I was going to die because there was so much unknown. I knew that from the minute we crossed the border, we were in enemy territory, and that they knew this tenant territory more than us. Look, spoiler alert, I didn't die, but I was scared the entire time I was there. I remember the next morning being in a up at the border, and some of you can go to the border now. I'm not sure it's still, right now it's not open, but there is a tourist area where you can take your picture standing between two flags, an Israeli flag and and a Lebanese flag where the border is. They literally open the gate and the transport truck drives you in. And I remember driving through Lebanon, and it was absolutely beautiful. I mean, it was gorgeous. I mean, just forests and lush and rivers. And uh, I had heard Lebanon was beautiful, but I wasn't prepared for absolutely how beautiful it was. But then once I got to my base, we got our orders. And what we did every night at dusk, we would get in our tank and we would drive to a hilltop and we would turn on our night vision. And all night we would look through our night vision looking for Hezbollah. And they were out looking for us. And we just did this night after night, hoping to find them before they found us. And luckily, I survived. But now that I'm actually explaining it, it really doesn't sound like much of a strategy. It does really just seem like we were putting ourselves in harm's way. But I remember being very, very afraid and just so relieved when it was over. And I must say, how all of us have a recurring dream, that one dream that keeps coming back, maybe once every 3 months or so. My recurring dream, I'd say every 2 or 3 months, I have a dream where I'm in uniform and surrounded by tanks, and they're telling me you're going into Lebanon. And I tell them, "What are you talking about? I'm 50 years old. I've got a wife and kids." And they're like, "No, no, no. You've got to go back in." And I don't have a choice. And I get in my tank and we go through the fence and we start driving back into Lebanon. And then somewhere around there, I wake up. But it obviously still has a place in my psychology that I guess I haven't completely worked through. We're going to take a quick break and then we're going to come back and talk about Israel's next involvement with Lebanon. That would be the Second Lebanon War in 2006. I'm Joel Chasnoff. This is Inside Israel. Be back in a few secs. Welcome back to Inside Israel. I'm Joel Chasnoff. Today's episode is Lebanon Unpacked. So now we're at the summer of 2006. This is what's known as Lebanon Stein, Lebanon 2. There probably is an official name to this war, but Israelis call it the Second Lebanon War. Hezbollah kills 3 IDF soldiers on the northern border and they kidnap 2 in July of 2006. And so Israel invades Lebanon. And I have friends from my own service who were called up for the reserves. And by the way, I was living in the US at the time, but I did call the Israeli consulate. And despite these dreams, I called the consulate and said, "Look, I'm here. And if my unit is going in, here's where you can find me." And at that point, I was already, well, I think a little, maybe in my approaching 40, and I was a little too old and not high up on the list. They did not call me back. In any case, I have friends who went in as part of their reserve service, and they told me it was an absolute balagan, chaos. Maps were out of date. Equipment was ripped and falling apart. They didn't have enough equipment to go around. They said that they would go into Lebanon and then immediately come back out of Lebanon, back in Israel, that there was no real strategy. There was this real hesitance to have casualties, so we wanted to fight, but not too hard. It was a real debacle, the second Lebanon war. So why did we even go in the first place? Well, I told you, in May of 2000, Ehud Barak pulled us out of Lebanon unilaterally. And that was the problem. We left a vacuum once again. We left unilaterally. And during those 6 years, between 2000 and 2006, Hezbollah was able to build up its arsenal again, to get weapons and uniforms and money from Iran, to start digging tunnels, to start building new bases, to move in new rocket launchers. And they were able to build up their forces because we simply left without really bothering to ask, well, what's going to happen now? So this war actually ends after 34 days. It's a relatively short war, but it's a very chaotic war. It ends with UN Resolution 1701. And those of you who listen to the podcast regularly know that I often remark that in 2023 alone, the United Nations passed 8 times as many resolutions against Israel than it had against the rest of the world combined during 2023. And yet one resolution it has never bothered to enforce is UN Resolution 1701. UN Resolution 1701 says that Hezbollah has to be north of the Litani River, which is about 20 miles north of Israel. That was the ceasefire agreement at the end of the 2006 war. Israel left Lebanon after 34 days, but the UN never enforced this resolution. So what happens? Hezbollah starts building up its arsenal, building fortifications in the south of Lebanon, preparing for the next war. Now, it's debatable who actually won this second Lebanon war. I think most Israelis would say that that Hezbollah won that war, not because Hezbollah captured territory, but the mere fact that the mightiest army in the Middle East, the Israeli army, couldn't actually defeat Hezbollah in that way. It was seen as a victory for Hezbollah. And just the fact that Hezbollah still exists after this 2006 war was a victory for many of us think, for Hezbollah. One real notable incident from this short 34-day war in the summer of 2006, that would be the death of Michael Levin, Zichrono Livracha. Michael was a lone soldier from Philadelphia. He himself went to Camp Ramah, did the conservative movement's Nativ program in Jerusalem, and then joined the paratroopers. And he was actually back in the U.S. visiting his family. He was up at Camp Ramah in the Poconos when the war in Lebanon broke out. And he flew back to Israel and hooked up with his unit, his paratrooper unit in South Lebanon. And after a few days, he was killed in a firefight in South Lebanon. Why is this particularly significant? Well, as I told you, when I was a lone soldier, there were only a few hundred of us, and it was impossible to get our rights. Nobody knew who we were or why we were there. They thought we were out of our minds. When Michael was killed, his mother, Harriet, was concerned that they wouldn't even have a minyan to say Kaddish at Michael's grave at his funeral in Jerusalem. So she had a few friends living in Israel and said, could you just put it out on Facebook that there's this soldier being buried on Mount Herzl in Jerusalem, and that we're trying to get 10 people together so we can say Kaddish at Michael's funeral. Well, the morning of Michael's funeral, there was a huge traffic jam in Jerusalem, and Harriet figured that there were other funerals at Har Herzl, and that's why there were all these cars packed, going into Mount Herzl. But it turns out that all these cars were there for Michael. Thousands and thousands of Israelis turned out so that Harriet and Mark could say Kaddish for their son properly during Michael's funeral. And this is very significant because Michael Levin became the face of lone soldiers. Today, there are more than 7,000 lone soldiers in the IDF. They come from 70 countries in the world. So it's not just the US and England and Canada, it's Mexico and Argentina and Denmark and Japan and Thailand and countries I can't even name. And really, the reason that there is such a thing as lone soldiers, it's because of Michael. And Israelis know who they are too. So lone soldiers went from being, who the hell are you, to, oh my God, you're a lone soldier. We're so proud of you. Israelis really revere lone soldiers. And the reason is Michael Levin. And he was killed during that 2006 war in Lebanon. And just a short tangential note, in a couple of months, I am going to be interviewing Harriet Levin. She's now a close friend of mine. I'm going to be interviewing Harriet, Michael's mother, about Michael's legacy and what has happened to lone soldiers and the Lone Soldier Center and really everything that's come after Michael and since he was tragically killed in 2006. So she will be on this podcast in a couple of months. I'll, of course, keep you updated when that happens. So, the next really significant date in terms of Lebanon is October 8th, 2023. You all know what happened on October 7th. On October 8th, Hezbollah begins attacking Israel to show solidarity with Hamas. That's their stated reason, right? With the people of Gaza. You got to ask, though, what happened between the end of the war in 2006 and October 8th, 2023, right? I mean, that's 17 years. What was going on during those 17 years? Well, we didn't really know for sure until the IDF entered Lebanon on the ground a couple months ago. What we discovered is that during that 17-year period from 2006 to 2023, Hezbollah basically began preparing for an October 7th style attack that would have dwarfed October 7th had it actually happened. They built an extensive tunnel network that might even be more extensive than the one that existed in Gaza. They began assembling weapons in all the homes in South Lebanon. So every home in every village, and I mean every home, in every village in South Lebanon became a little military base for Hezbollah, where they would store rocket launchers and rockets and grenades, pieces of rocket launchers, rifles, uniforms. The idea was that the Radwan unit, which is the elite militant unit of Hezbollah, that on the appointed day, the Radwan unit, dressed as civilians, would ride motorbikes to all these houses in South Lebanon. They would change into their uniforms, load themselves up with ammunition, and then using the tunnel network, sneak into Israel and slaughter and kidnap as many Israelis as they could. We didn't know the extent of this until we went in there on the ground a couple months ago. So that brings up the question of where we are right now. Well, first of all, let's look at some of the lessons and implications. From our 4 forays into Lebanon, and 5, if you're including our time in the security zone for 18 years, what have we actually learned? Well, one thing is that we've never actually finished the job. The reason we have to keep going in is because we always leave Hezbollah standing. And I'm afraid that's exactly what's happened this time as well. We've had our boots on their necks, and just when they were about to suffocate, we removed our boots and agreed to this ceasefire. And I assure you, I promise you, that right now, as you're listening to this, Hezbollah is busy rearming and figuring out their next plan of attack on Israel. They might not know exactly what it is, but I guarantee you, they are planning for the next attack. Another lesson, let's talk about unilateral withdrawals. I think we can learn by now that the idea of simply withdrawing unilaterally, it doesn't work. We did that in Lebanon In 2000, Ehud Barak pulled us out. Didn't work. In 2006, we had this ceasefire that supposedly would lead to Hezbollah going north of the Litani River, but we didn't enforce it. The UN didn't enforce it, and they just built themselves up again. And in 2005, we withdrew from Gaza. Unilateral withdrawal. Remember, Gaza used to be part of Israel. We had Israelis living in Gaza, and in 2005, we simply withdrew from Gaza unilaterally. And who was the prime minister then, by the way? Ariel Sharon. Go figure. So what we can see is that withdrawing unilaterally, without knowing what's going to happen next, without knowing how to fill the vacuum, it has never worked for Israel. So those who say that we should simply withdraw from the West Bank and let them form a Palestinian state and we'll be able to defend ourselves, you can see why pretty much no Israelis favor that right now. Because we know what happens when we withdraw unilaterally. We know what happens when there's a vacuum and we do not know how to fill it. I think the other lesson we can learn here is about ourselves, our own hubris, that arrogance that Israelis have, believing that we can go in and we can make order out of the chaos of the Arab world. And I'm going to say things right now, I'm going to say something right now, which is really not politically correct. In our day and age that we live in right now, what we're really supposed to believe is that we're all pretty much the same, that, we're all human beings, and what we all really want is just for our children to be healthy and happy and to lead good lives with our families. We're all the same. It's really a beautiful notion. It's very idealistic. And unfortunately, I don't think it's true. You need to understand. Now, I'm not saying by any means that all Arabs are like this. Not at all. Remember, a fifth of Israeli citizens are Arab, and for the most part, we have very good relations between the Jewish and Arab populations in Israel. But what I am saying is that we need to recognize that Arab culture in society is different from Israeli Jewish culture in society. I've talked about this before on the pod, how important the idea is of saving face and honor in Arab culture and revenge. It is a big ideal in Arab culture. It's also a very tribal culture, a lot of warring amongst tribes. We cannot simply go into Arab territory and think that we know how to solve their problems because it is a cultural difference. And by the way, this is a lesson for the U.S. as well that they have learned in Afghanistan, in Iraq. So I don't feel bad saying this because, look, we Israelis have our own characteristics as well, whether it's our arrogance or not wanting to be a sucker, a friar. We're all prisoners to our own psychologies, but we need to recognize that there is such a thing as Arab psychology and Arab culture, and it's different from ours. And we don't, we should stop thinking that we have the tools to go in there and fix all the problems. We shouldn't underestimate the importance of Arab culture. But it also means that one thing I want to communicate to you is that everything Israel does, we're actually doing it for two reasons. Reason number one is the goal itself. But reason number two is to send a message to our enemies. Because in the Middle East, messaging is everything. We need to send the message that we're strong. Because when we send the message that we're weak, that is what invites our enemies to attack us. So it's not simply a matter of being strong. It's sending the message that we are going to continue to be strong. And that's another takeaway that I would hope you would take from this episode. The importance of messaging in the Middle East and how a lot of diplomats, certainly American diplomats, don't really understand Middle East culture. One thing that I would like you, the listeners, to do moving forward is to start looking at events in Israel from the Middle Eastern perspective. Because, it's really nice to think that Israel is just America far away. We have freedom of the press and democracy and a lot of LGBTQ rights. And, we're sort of like America 7,000 miles away from New York. And what I want you to understand is that much as it looks like America, And as much as Israelis speak English and watch Netflix and watch American TV shows, it is not. It is the Middle East. And we need to play by the rules of the Middle East in order to survive. And I think a lot of people here in the States, certainly the ones who are protesting on campuses and even, organizations, is it Rabbis for Peace? Is that what it's called? They don't understand the Middle Easternness of this problem. I think they're extremely naive in their idealistic view of what human nature supposedly should be, without realizing that our neighborhood is much different from theirs. So a quick recap. 1978, Israel goes into Lebanon for 1 month, but the real history begins in 1982 with the First Lebanon War. We achieve our goals within about 2 months. However, the Christian prime minister is assassinated. Hezbollah comes into the vacuum. Israel ends up staying until 2000, 18 years, when we leave. 2006, Second Lebanon War, leading to UN Resolution 1701, which is never enforced. We're then out of Lebanon for 17 years. During that time, Hezbollah rearms, rebuilds, and that brings us to today. We're going to take a quick break, and then I'm going to come back with a really, really quick recap of this week's biggest news stories. I had to choose only 3. There were a lot. And then 2 questions. See you in a few seconds. Welcome back to Inside Israel. For those of you listening on the live broadcast right now, I see you're putting questions in the chat. What I'm going to do is write those down and answer them in a future episode, next week's episode. But lately, because of the number of questions and the length, certainly, of this episode, I'm not going to be able to answer the chat questions right now, but I will get to them next week. The best way to get me questions is to email them ahead of time. Okay, let's talk about a couple of news stories from the week. A huge news week. I had to choose only a few. First of all, the fall of the Assad regime. Now, again, my job here, I'm not a geopolitical scientist who's going to make sense of all the politics of it. What I am going to tell you is what Israelis are actually saying. And I'll tell you, a lot of Israelis, most Israelis, don't know what to say about this one. We're really confused and we are watching. There are really 3 big takes on this Assad story. Number one, is this an opportunity? Maybe, certainly we're already destroying weapons. The IDF is destroying weapons, places where weapons are stored, and certainly chemical weapons. We're destroying them in Syria because we don't want the new leaders, militants, whatever, to get their hands on them. We have taken over the southern side of Har Hermon, the Mount Hermon, the Hermon mountain. So we have an elite unit called Shaldag that is now on the other side of that mountain, which is overlooking Syria, which is a huge take for us. A lot of us are thinking, might this be the opportunity to take out Iran's nuclear program? Might this be the opportunity we were waiting for? Because this shows that Iran is really weak. Hezbollah is not helping to defend, was not helping to defend the Assad regime. This could be the fall of Iran. That's what Israelis are saying. We're crossing our fingers. Might this be it? So that's kind of how Israelis are looking at it, but we really don't know. It is a day-to-day story. What I do want to say to all of you listening right now is please do not be fooled. You might be reading in Western media about revolutionaries and rebels and freedom fighters overthrowing the dreaded Assad regime, but make no mistake, these freedom fighters, these rebels, they are jihadists. They are talking about going all the way to Jerusalem. They are Al-Qaeda style. Israel does not need an Al-Qaeda state in Syria right next to it. So please don't get the idea that these are peace-loving, LGBTQ right-loving, freedom of the press promoting freedom lovers. It's not. It's jihadists, and Israel does have an issue on its hand as we continue to monitor this big story. All right. Second story I want to bring to you. This might be a little bit under the radar here. 7 IDF soldiers have been killed in the last 48 hours, 3 in Gaza and 4 in Lebanon. And I want to focus on these 4 in Lebanon. Why are they still there if we have a ceasefire? Well, the ceasefire calls for us to be able to be there for up to 60 days. And we are still finding Hezbollah is not living up to their terms of the agreement. They are still trying to assemble weapons. They are still trying to use their tunnel network. They are still riding around. They're not supposed to be south of the Litani River. I mean, it's not that they're not supposed to be doing militant activities. Hezbollah is not supposed to be south of the Litani River, and they are. And so that is why we're still there. What's significant about these 4 soldiers who were just killed in Lebanon is they were killed by accident. They were killed by an explosion left. There were explosive devices to blow up a Hezbollah tunnel that were left there by other Israeli soldiers that were not detonated, and it accidentally went off and killed them. This is really significant because in Gaza, I know we're talking about Lebanon right now, but I want to shift to Gaza. Close to 20% of the soldiers who've been killed in Gaza were killed by what in English is so horribly called friendly fire. In Israel, it's called dutzim, du-tzdadi, which means same-side fire. But think about that. Close to 20% of the soldiers killed in Gaza were killed by accident by Israelis or by explosives that we Israelis set. I think that is a story that's probably not much is known about it, which is why I wanted to bring it to you. We have to talk about the torching of the synagogue in Melbourne, Australia. There's really not much to say about it, except that Israelis, not only are they horrified, but they see this as a very sad pattern. You know, there's Amsterdam where Israeli soccer fans were attacked, and who cares if they were, yes, maybe they were unruly and misbehaving, but this was a pogrom carried out on Israeli Jewish soccer fans, and it's not even recognized as a terror attack in Amsterdam. So it's part of a pattern that Israelis are seeing, is that ironically, even with wars in Israel and all the chaos we have there, you know, many Israelis are starting to believe that the safest place still is to be in Israel. You know, I should mention the murder of the Chabad rabbi 2 weeks ago. I believe it was in the UAE. Am I correct on that? In any case, it's sort of this pattern that Jews, Israelis outside of Israel, are not safe. Finally, there is talk of a hostage deal that with Assad fleeing and with Hezbollah weak and Iran weaker and Hamas perhaps close to collapsing, that this might be the time for a hostage deal. And there are rumors in Israel that Hamas has compiled a list of the Israelis who are being held hostage in preparation for a deal. A lot of Israelis are talking about this. This is huge. I mean, we're living in a dual world in Israel. I've said this before on the pod, that on the one hand, we are trying to go about our normal lives, but on the other hand, we are aware every day that we still have hostages, now more than 420 days in Gaza. We see their posters everywhere. It is unfathomable to us that they are still not home. And so, yes, we are talking about this, the idea that the hostages could be released soon. My opinion, I don't see it happening. I don't think it's going to happen. In order for a hostage deal to happen, you would need to ask who benefits here. And I don't see who benefits by the release of the hostages. Certainly Hamas doesn't, unless we withdraw completely, which is what they're demanding. And the current government does not benefit from the release of hostages. I know that might be hard for a lot of you to hear, but I believe that it's the truth. You got to realize that Netanyahu's coalition is being held together because of right-wing members who right now are talking about resettling Gaza. They want to rebuild Israeli Jewish villages in Gaza. And you know what? After hearing everything I've said tonight, there might be a part of you that thinks that's what we need to do, that we shouldn't leave a vacuum, that things are actually better when we're living there. Maybe that is the case. But what you need to understand is that Netanyahu's coalition falls apart if he pulls the IDF out of Gaza. Because if the IDF comes out of Gaza, that is the end of the dream of resettling Gaza. And his coalition will fall apart. So I hope I'm wrong. I would love it if next week when I come on this pod, I tell you, man, I got to eat my words. The hostages are out. That would be wonderful and amazing. But I'm telling you the honest to God truth, I do not think it's going to happen. I wish it weren't so, but that's how I see it. Next week's broadcast of Inside Israel, next week's live broadcast of Inside Israel is going to take place on Monday, December 16th at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. I would do it on the 15th. I'm free that day, but it happens to be Joel's birthday. So we're going to give myself the day off and do the pod on the 16th instead. If you want links for that broadcast or future podcasts, just go to joelchasnoff.com/podcast, and I'm going to put that in the chat as well. That is in the chat, yes, right now. If you do listen to Apple or Spotify, please give this podcast a rating because it really helps. That's how Apple and Spotify decide what to promote, by the ratings that you guys give. And again, this episode and all episodes that I do solo are uploaded. Almost all episodes are uploaded on Wednesdays to Apple and Spotify. I'm on tour right now doing comedy, talking about my books. You can catch me on the road and say hi. To see my schedule, go to joelchasnoff.com/shows and find out where I'll be. And again, I really love the questions. You know, we actually ran out of time. We're not going to get to questions tonight. I will save them for next week. But I always love answering your questions. It shows me what you're interested in. So you can email me through the website or joel@joelchasnoff.com. I want to thank all of you for listening. Until next time, lehitraot. And I'm going to leave the chat open a couple more minutes for any more questions to filter in and for you guys to hang out.